The air was already heavy that afternoon. A cloudless sky hung over the plaza, the marble steps of Arlington gleaming under the sun. Rows of officials stood stiffly in their suits, cameras perched on tripods, and a hushed silence wrapped around the crowd like an invisible cloak. They weren't just watching a ceremony, they were watching history unfold. And then he stepped forward. Vladimir Putin, his posture as sharp as his reputation, cut across the plaza with slow, deliberate strides. The media lenses followed him with a hunger for spectacle. Whispers rippled through the audience like a restless tide. Some leaned forward, others froze where they stood. The only figure that didn't move was the one he walked toward, the silent sentinel of the tomb of the unknown soldier. The guard stood rigid, ceremonial rifle resting at his side, eyes locked ahead. He wasn't a politician, he wasn't a man of power, he was tradition embodied in human form. Years of training had carved stillness into his bones, discipline into his breath. To him, silence was not emptiness. It was sacred. Putin stopped, barely a stride away, his gaze cutting like ice. He tilted his head, a faint smirk forming at the corner of his mouth, as though daring the guard to acknowledge his presence. The crowd braced. Reporters inched closer, record lights blinking red. Children clutched their parents' hands, sensing the tension adults couldn't hide. Veterans in the audience instinctively straightened, their bodies remembering orders shouted decades ago, and then came the command. Low, firm, spoken with the expectation of instant obedience. Move. The single word sliced through the plaza, louder than the shuffle of feet, louder than the clicks of cameras. The command carried not just authority, it carried arrogance. But the guard didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't even breathe differently. His chin remained steady, his gaze fixed on eternity. A beat of silence followed, thick and suffocating. Then came the murmur, scattered whispers swirling through. The crowd, would he actually resist? Would he disobey? The atmosphere was electric, a storm gathering without clouds. And in that fragile moment, when power demanded submission, the world saw something else instead. The world expected obedience. Instead, it witnessed unshakable honor. Children's eyes widened in awe. Veterans felt their throats tighten. Reporters leaned in, their cameras devouring every fraction of stillness. The stage was set. Power had spoken. Now the silence would answer. In that instant, it had been carried there through years of discipline, through memories of war, through the beating heart of one soldier who had chosen stillness over surrender. The guard, who stood before Putin, was not just a man in uniform, he was the product of battles both seen and unseen. His name was never spoken during the ceremony. Protocol demanded anonymity. To the world, he was simply the guard. But behind the rigid frame and polished weapon lay a history written in scars. Years earlier, he had been a soldier deployed overseas. In deserts where the heat cracked lips, in mountains where every shadow held a threat, he had learned the meaning of endurance. He had seen friends laugh in the morning and never return by nightfall. One of them was Daniel, his closest brother-in-arms. Daniel had a way of finding light even in the darkest corners, always carrying a notebook where he scribbled letters to his mother, sketches of home, promises of a future that never came. One night, an ambush stole Daniel's life. The guard had held the blood-soaked dog tag in his palm, his own body trembling with rage, grief, and disbelief. From that moment on, silence was no longer just absence. Silence became sacred. It became the language of remembrance. When he returned, home medals pinned to his chest felt like hollow metal. Crowds cheered, but he couldn't hear them. What echoed in his ears were the final breaths of a friend, the sound of boots running through dust, the whispered words, "Don't let them forget." He made a choice. He joined the elite ranks of the tomb guards not for glory, but for vow. Every step, every turn, every silent hour on duty was for Daniel, and for every soldier whose name was carved into stone but no longer spoken aloud, the tomb of the unknown. Soldier was not just a monument to him, it was a promise, a place where silence reigned because words could never repay the debt. The marble, the eternal flame, the carved wreaths, they all whispered the same truth. Sacrifice must be honored, and so, he trained endless days under the punishing sun, endless nights rehearsing steps until they were second nature. Rifle held at precise angles, shoes shined until they reflected the sky. He was molded into something more than human, a living embodiment of discipline, the kind of discipline that could not be bought, bribed, or broken, but discipline is often tested. That test came in the form of a man who had walked through countless palaces and summits, expecting doors to open at his presence. Vladimir Putin had spent decades wielding power like a weapon, unaccustomed to resistance. Where he went, Obedience followed. His voice carried weight that few dared challenge, and on this day, before the tomb, he expected no different. To Putin, the guard was just another soldier, another symbol that could be bent to his will. He saw the marble steps not as sacred ground, but as a stage. His command was not just about moving a man, it was about bending tradition, showing the world that even in a place where silence was sacred, his voice could still dominate. That the plaza itself seemed to sense the weight of this clash. Arlington was not just any location, it was hallowed ground, rows upon rows of white headstones, stretched endlessly into the horizon, each one carrying a story untold. Beneath the earth rested soldiers who had never returned home, who had given everything yet asked for nothing. Families came here with flowers and tears, hoping that in the quiet rustle of leaves, they might still hear their loved ones. To disrespect this place was to disrespect all of them. That was why veterans in the crowd stood taller when Putin approached, why their jaws tightened when his command rang out. They knew what it meant to stand watch, to honor the fallen, to treat silence as sacred. For them, this was more than politics, it was a line between respect and dishonor. The guard, however, did not think of politics or audiences. In that instant, his mind carried him back to the desert. He felt again the weight of Daniel's dog tag against his chest. He heard again the promise whispered into the night. Don't let them forget. Every fiber of his being told him one thing, to stand. And so, when Putin's voice demanded movement, he remained rooted not in defiance of a man, but in devotion to the countless men and women who could no longer stand for themselves. His silence was not rebellion, it was loyalty. The media did not understand this at first. Their lenses zoomed in, hungry for drama. Reporters scribbled notes about international tensions, about the clash of authority and protocol. They saw a political standoff. They missed the deeper truth. But the veterans understood. The children, too young to grasp the politics, sensed it in their bones. They felt the immovable force of tradition standing before them. They watched a man embody something their textbooks could never teach, that sometimes the greatest strength is refusing to yield. Putin didn't see it that way. To him, hesitation was weakness, silence was an insult. He took the guard's stillness as defiance, not reverence, and that misunderstanding was the spark that would ignite the confrontation. For now, the stage was set. A leader who demanded control, a guard who carried the weight of fallen brothers, and a plaza where silence was thicker than any speech. The world was about to witness what happens when unstoppable force meets immovable honor. The command still hung in the air. Move, but the guard remained as immovable as stone. His boots, perfectly aligned with the marble, didn't shift a fraction. His eyes, locked forward, never flickered, not even the tightening of a jaw. The trade that he had heard the order, the crowd shifted uneasily. The sound of shoes scraping against pavement and the faint clicking of cameras were the only noises in a plaza that had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. Putin's brow furrowed. He wasn't a man accustomed to resistance. Wherever he went, Moscow, Beijing, even the gilded halls of the Kremlin, people bent. Doors opened, guards saluted, voices softened. Yet here, in front of a single American soldier, his command had been swallowed by silence. He tried again, this time louder. I said, move. Still nothing. A child's gasp cut through the crowd. A mother pulled her son closer, whispering for him to be still. Veterans folded their arms, the corners of their mouths twitching upward ever so slightly. They knew what they were witnessing. They knew the rules of the guard. No distraction, no compromise, no surrender. Putin stepped closer. His polished shoes tapped sharply against the stone, each stride deliberate, echoing like hammer strikes. He stopped so near that his shadow fell across the guard's face. He leaned in, his lips curling into a thin smile, as though to whisper, a secret meant for one man only. You stand for the dead, he said, in accented English, voice dripping with disdain. But the living command you, and I command you to step aside. Reporters scribbled furiously. Lenses zoomed in, catching every bead of sweat on foreheads in the crowd. Microphones tilted forward as though the air itself might shatter under the weight of the silence. The guard did not flinch. His eyes, fixed in ceremonial stillness, looked beyond Putin as though gazing through him into eternity. It was not defiance for its own sake. It was loyalty, deeper than words, carved into his very bones. The tension spread outward like ripples on water. A group of schoolchildren, visiting on a field trip, clutched their teacher's hands. A veteran in a wheelchair raised his chin, tears threatening his eyes. A tourist from overseas muttered to her husband, "Why doesn't he move? Why doesn't he just obey?" because it wasn't obedience that held the plaza together. It was honor. But Putin pressed harder. He circled the guard now, each step slow, measured, predatory. He glanced toward the crowd, his expression calm, as if daring them to question his authority. His fingers brushed the guard's sleeve, testing the boundaries. Gasps erupted. One man shouted, "Don't touch him." Another voice hissed for silence. Still, the guard did not break. His body was steel. The veterans in the crowd began to stir. Some stood taller, hands over hearts. Others clenched their fists, their old instincts flaring. They had worn uniforms once. They had saluted the fallen. They knew what this moment meant, but the general public didn't fully understand. To them, this was a spectacle and uncomfortable dance between power and silence. The reporters whispered among themselves. Will he give in? What if this becomes an incident? Is security going to step in? Yet no security detail dared to interfere. They stood frozen on the edges, torn between two impossibles, respecting sacred ground, or protecting a world leader. Putin stopped directly in front of the guard again. He looked him up and down like a king appraising a statue. His smirk widened. So, you are made of stone. Is that it? You think silence makes you strong? No reply. Putin raised his voice so the crowd could hear. This is weakness. Tradition is weakness. Watch. All of you, your guard cannot resist forever. No man can. He took another step closer, so near, their shoulders nearly brushed. He was testing the last fibers of boundaries. His breath practically touched the guard's ear. The silence became unbearable. The children buried their faces against their parents. The veterans stood rigid, their jaws clenched in fury. A woman in the crowd began to cry not because she feared violence, but because she understood the sanctity. Being threatened, the guard remained unmoved, and that immobility, that refusal to yield, was louder than any shout. Seconds turned to eternities. The plaza was no longer a gathering place. It was a crucible. The weight of centuries pressed down on every soul present, and the man at the center, one soldier, rifle at his side, eyes locked forward, became a monument himself. Putin's expression shifted from amusement to irritation. He snapped his fingers at his entourage, as though summoning approval for his performance. But even his men looked uneasy. This was not Russia. This was not his soil. The rules here were not his to bend, and yet he tried again. His hand rose, hovering near the guard's face, fingers twitching as though daring to make contact. The crowd held its collective breath. 1 inch more, and the unspoken rules of honor would shatter. Whispers flew. He wouldn't dare. He can't touch him. What will the guard do? Even the reporters had stopped writing. Their pens hovered uselessly above notebooks, their cameras capturing every millisecond, as though history could be frozen frame by frame. The veterans knew the truth. They muttered it under their breath, prayers disguised as warnings. Don't break, hold the line. The guard stood as still as eternity. But every man has his threshold. Every tradition has a line carved deep into its foundation, and the instant Putin's fingers brushed the edge of that sacred line, the guard's silence would transform into something far more powerful. The storm had not yet broken, but the air was crackling with lightning. The escalation had reached its peak. One more push, one more violation, and history would no longer remain silent. The air in the plaza had become unbearable. People shifted restlessly, their nerves stretched thin as piano wire. The reporters stopped whispering. The veterans clenched their teeth. The children, though too young to grasp the politics, sensed the electricity in the air and buried their faces in their parents' arms. And then it happened. Putin's hand, which had been hovering just inches from the guard's shoulder, finally made contact. A small touch at first, barely a press of fingertips against the crisp blue fabric. But in that sacred space, on those sacred steps, it was not a touch. It was a violation. The crowd gasped as though one breath had been ripped from hundreds of lungs at once. A veteran shouted, "You don't touch him." The cry echoed raw with fury, before being swallowed by the stunned silence. For the first time, the guard moved. It was not hesitation, not stumbling, but a sudden, razor-sharp precision, like a blade pulled from its sheath. His left foot stamped down, his body pivoted in perfect cadence, rifle snapping upright with a crack that split the silence. His head turned, eyes locking onto the intruder, and then came the voice. The guard's command thundered across the plaza, each word carved in steel, echoing against the marble and through the bones of every listener. Stand back, respect the fallen. The sound was not human, it was elemental. It was discipline given voice, a hurricane compressed into 3 words. The crowd froze. Children stopped crying, their wide eyes staring in awe. Veterans straightened instinctively, their bodies remembering the command voice of drill sergeants from long ago. Even reporters, trained to stay detached, felt their pens tremble in their hands. And Putin, he staggered. The man who had faced parliaments, who had stared down presidents, who had silenced entire nations with a glance, now looked visibly shaken. His smirk cracked, his composure fractured, his hand dropped instantly, recoiling as though burned by the sheer force of the soldier's voice. The silence that followed was deeper than before. It was not uneasy now, it was reverent. Every person in the plaza knew they had just witnessed something sacred, something that went beyond politics, beyond power. The guard did not lower his weapon. He stood in full command stance, his chest heaving only once before stilling again. His eyes drilled through Putin as though he wasn't a man but a storm to be weathered. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. Putin's lips parted as if to reply, but no sound came. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the raw astonishment etched on his face. His entourage shifted nervously, security agents whispering into earpieces, unsure whether to intervene or let the silence reign. But the plaza had already decided. The crowd erupted not in cheers, not in shouts, but in stunned murmurs of awe. A child's small voice broke through, high and trembling. He told him to respect the fallen, and that single sentence seemed to echo louder than any applause. The veterans, tears glistening in their eyes, raised trembling salutes. Reporters whispered frantically into microphones, their words tumbling out. The guard has spoken. Unprecedented, a voice that stopped Putin in his tracks. Yet through it all, the guard did not move again. He did not gloat, he did not falter. He returned his rifle to position, boots aligned with marble once more. The storm had passed, and now he was stone again, yielding eternal dot, but the damage had been done. Putin's composure was gone. He tried to adjust his jacket, tried to straighten his shoulders, but the weight of that command still hung over him. The crowd's eyes were no longer on him, they were fixed on the guard. The man he had tried to bend had instead bent the entire plaza around him. What had begun as arrogance had turned into humiliation. And though no one said it aloud, everyone felt it. This moment would not remain hidden. Cameras had captured every second. The world would soon see. Still, for the guard, it was not about the cameras, not about the man he had just silenced. His hand brushed against the hidden dog tag beneath his uniform. Daniel's name pressed into cold metal. His vow whispered again in his memory. Don't let them forget. That was why he had spoken, not for himself, not for pride, but for the fallen. The plaza trembled with an unspoken truth. Tradition had faced arrogance, silence had faced power, and silence had won. Asterisk for a heartbeat. The plaza was frozen. The echo of the guard's command still rattled against the marble, as if the very stones were unwilling to let it go. Putin stood rigid, his hand half raised, eyes wide, not with anger this time, but disbelief. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not in Moscow, not in Geneva, not in the countless palaces where he strode like a king, and yet here, in front of a silent soldier bound by tradition, his power had been shattered by 3 words. Security flinched first. His entourage surged forward, their dark suits parting the crowd. Secret Service agents, torn between protecting sacred ground and diffusing a diplomatic crisis, rushed in parallel. Microphones caught the frantic blur of commands, whispered into earpieces. Hold position, do not escalate, keep cameras back. But the cameras had already done their work. Every lens had caught Putin's face at the exact moment the guard thundered, stand back, respect the fallen. The footage was already broadcasting live, bouncing across networks, streaming onto millions of screens. The crowd stirred. Veterans in the front rows, eyes wet with pride, saluted the guard. Children whispered to their parents, repeating his words as though they were scripture. Reporters fought to steady their voices as they narrated the unthinkable. In a stunning and historic moment, the tomb guard has defied an order from Vladimir Putin himself. Putin tried to recover. He squared his shoulders, adjusted his jacket, and forced his lips into a thin, tight smile. He stepped back a pace, attempting to make it look deliberate, but the truth was written all over him. The world had seen hesitation. They had seen him flinch. The guard, meanwhile, did not move again. His rifle returned to its resting angle, boots locked in perfect alignment. His eyes stared straight ahead, as if nothing had happened. The plaza's storm had not touched him, and that was the true humiliation. Because while Putin twitched, while his entourage scrambled, while the crowd murmured, the guard looked untouched, unshaken. Eternal. The symbolism was undeniable. A man of politics had tried to bend tradition. and tradition had bent him instead. The silence of one soldier had roared louder than any speech, louder than any parade. News anchors would later replay the moment in slow motion, Putin's hand reaching forward, the guard's sudden pivot, the booming command that made the Russian leader stagger back. They would loop it endlessly, frame by frame, until the entire world had memorized the image. But in the plaza, in that moment, it was not about news. It was about reverence. The colonel in charge of the guard details stepped forward now, his face carved with discipline but his eyes burning with pride. He gave no public praise protocol forbade it, but as he passed behind the guard, he gave a single, sharp nod, a silent salute only the guard would feel. Putin's entourage urged him to leave. They gestured toward the motorcade waiting at the perimeter, whispering urgently in Russian. He resisted at first, his pride unwilling to retreat. But the crowd's eyes were burning into him, and the cameras were unrelenting. He had no choice. He turned on his heel and walked away, and that was the moment the plaza exhaled. Not a cheer, not applause because this was sacred ground. Instead, a wave of silent respect washed across the space. People removed their hats. Veterans lifted trembling hands in salute. Parents bent down to whisper to their children, "Remember this. Remember what you saw today." The guard, however, gave no acknowledgement. He did not watch Putin leave. He did not watch the crowd stir. He simply resumed his march 21 steps down the mat, rifle at his side, turning with the same precision he had practiced thousands of times to the outside world. It was a viral moment, a humiliation for a leader, but to him, it was just duty. Duty to Daniel. Duty to the unknown soldiers resting beneath the stone. Duty to silence itself. Reporters scrambled to capture closing shots. Some wiped tears from their eyes, their professionalism shattered by the gravity of what they'd just witnessed. He didn't break, one whispered into her microphone. He didn't break, and indeed, that was the climax. Not that Putin had been silenced, but that the guard had remained unbroken. The plaza now carried two histories, one of arrogance exposed and one of honor reaffirmed. The guard walked his final measured steps, pivoted crisply, and resumed his vigil, rifle steady, eyes forward. Eternal silence restored. The man who had come expecting obedience left in quiet disgrace. The man who had given no words left a legacy that would be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. The moment was over. But the story had only just begun. Asterisk, the motorcade's engines hummed faintly in the distance, a low retreating growl as Putin's entourage departed the plaza. The crowd remained still, suspended in the weight of what they had just witnessed. Some tried to whisper to one another, but even their voices felt too loud, too intrusive in the sacred silence that returned to Arlington. The guard continued his watch. 21 measured steps, heel strike, rifle shift, pivot, 21 steps back again. Perfect cadence, perfect stillness, as though nothing had happened, but something had. The people in the plaza felt it in their bones. They had seen a moment when politics tried to bend tradition and failed. They had seen arrogance collapse against discipline, witnessed power humbled by silence, and though no cheer erupted, no applause thundered, the air was thick with reverence. A little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. Her eyes were wide, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried like a bell through the quiet. "Mama, he's a hero." The words rippled through the crowd. Some smiled faintly. Others felt tears sting their eyes. Veterans clenched their jaws, fighting emotion they hadn't expected. For them, hero was not a word to use lightly. But in this moment, no one doubted it fit. The guard didn't hear her, but if he had, he would have dismissed it. To him, this wasn't heroism. It was duty, a duty sworn in silence, carried out in stillness, bound to a promise made long ago. Behind the scenes, the colonel who oversaw the guard detail lingered in the shadows of the crowd. His own posture was as rigid as the men he commanded, his uniform immaculate. He had watched the confrontation unfold with a soldier's restraint, giving no outward sign of alarm. But now, as he looked at the guard resuming his vigil, pride swelled within him. He moved closer, pausing just out of the camera's view. He did not salute formally, protocol forbade it, but he gave a subtle, sharp nod, a silent recognition. Between men who understood what had just been defended, not a tomb, not even a tradition, but the very essence of honor. The guard did not react. He could not. Yet inside, he felt the weight of that nod as heavily as any metal. As the plaza began to empty, the crowd dispersing in hushed tones, the guard's thoughts wandered not away from his duty, but inward, to the memory he carried. like a second heartbeat. He felt the thin chain beneath his uniform press against his chest. A single dog tag rested there, cold against his skin. Daniel's name. For a moment, though his body remained still, his heart whispered, "We stood out ground, brother. We kept the promise." He remembered the night Daniel had fallen, the blood, the dust, the silence after the gunfire faded. He remembered the vow he had made, clutching that dog tag. "I'll make sure they never forget you. Never forget any of you." And here, now, in this plaza of marble and silence, that vow had been fulfilled. Not in speeches, not in medals, but in the refusal to yield. The guard drew in a slow breath, steadying himself, then released it. His steps continued. His silence deepened. From the outside, he was stone again, but inside, he carried the weight of memory and the quiet pride of having stood for something greater than himself. Reporters would soon file their stories. Anchors would analyze the footage. Commentators would debate the politics. The internet would explode with clips, memes, hashtags, and arguments. The world would see the confrontation as humiliation, as scandal, as spectacle. But here, at Arlington, it was none of those things. It was sacred. The guard did not need the world's recognition. He did not need headlines or applause. What he needed was the silence that honored Daniel, honored all the unknown soldiers who rested beneath the stone, honored every sacrifice written in blood and memory. As the sun lowered slightly in the sky, casting long shadows across the plaza, the guard's figure seemed almost carved from the same marble he defended, eternal, unmoving, a reminder that tradition, once forged in sacrifice, cannot be shaken by arrogance. And though he would never say it aloud, though no camera would ever capture it, deep inside he knew the truth. Today, silence had spoken louder than power. There are moments in history that never make it into textbooks, yet they etch themselves into the human spirit. They are not measured in speeches or decrees, but in silence and yielding, sacred silence. What happened that day on the plaza was not about politics. It was not about one man's arrogance or another's authority. It was about something older, something deeper. It was about the weight of sacrifice and the discipline forged in blood. The world had expected compliance. The crowd had braced for submission. Yet, what they saw instead was defiance, quiet, disciplined, and absolute. A soldier, sworn to stillness, stood immovable in the face of power. And in that stillness, he spoke louder than any leader ever could. The child's whisper still lingers. He's a hero. Simple words, but truer than the sharpest commentary. Because a hero is not always the one who advances with sword drawn or flag raised. Sometimes a hero is the one who does not move, who does not bow, who does not break. Veterans that day saw more than a confrontation. They saw themselves reflected in the guard's unshakable stance, their own memories of nights when silence meant survival, when holding ground meant saving lives. To them, his silence was not just strength, it was remembrance. And for the world, watching from afar, that single refusal to move became a symbol, a reminder that tradition is not weakness, that stillness is not surrender, that discipline, born of sacrifice, will always outlast arrogance born of ego. We live in an age where noise fills every corner of our lives, shouts of politics, storms of opinion, endless clamor for attention. But here, in this story, silence carried the weight of the fallen. Silence froze arrogance in its tracks. Remember this. Honor is not negotiable. Respect is not optional. Tradition is not weakness. Stillness is strength. So the next time you hear someone dismiss a ceremony, mock a ritual, or belittle a tradition, remember the guard. Remember his silence. Remember the way one man's stillness humbled power before the eyes of the world. Because in that silence, generations spoke. In that silence, sacrifice was remembered. And in that silence, honor lived on. This is not just a story of a confrontation. It is a story of legacy, of remembrance, and of a soldier's vow kept in the face of arrogance. And now, it's your turn to keep that vow alive. Share this story. Let it travel beyond this plaza, beyond this moment, beyond the marble and the silence. Subscribe to carry these stories forward, so the memory of sacrifice is never forgotten. Support the legacy of honor, not for the guard, not for the moment, but for the ones who never came home. Tradition is not weakness. Stillness is strength. And sometimes, the strongest voice in the world is the one that never speaks.